The 6 different ways that groups end give us quite a lot of insight into what's happening with al-Qaeda. The first being decapitation, the capture or killing of a leader. The second, negotiations, success, failure, repression, or reorientation to another kind of threat. The 2 pathways that we're seeing quite a lot of evidence of al-Qaeda following are failure, because al-Qaeda has actually had a lot of infighting about what exactly, when it's appropriate to, or inappropriate to kill Muslims, whether it's okay or not to call members of the Ummah apostates, who has the religious authority to be carrying out these operations. All of these things are sources of deep, deep dissension and a considerable amount of backlash when it comes to many of the people who are dying because of al-Qaeda claimed attacks. You know, a very large proportion of the people who have died as a result of attacks that al-Qaeda openly has claimed have been the very people that they're trying to attract to their following. And so this backlash has been very apparent since about 2008. If you look at the Pew Charitable Trust polls, the Gallup polls, there's lots of evidence that's been developed where you see many of the countries where al-Qaeda attacks have been most active and vigorous and have had most casualties. The public opinion within those countries has turned against bin Laden personally, when he was still alive, of course, and against al-Qaeda and against its mission and against the progress or lack of progress that they've been making. So that failure pathway has been very, very clearly apparent for al-Qaeda. But the other pathway that is possible for al-Qaeda, and where we also have to be quite concerned, is transition. There's a tendency to talk about the al-Qaeda, the global al-Qaeda threat, as a global insurgency. And that kind of imagery is just the wrong way to go in terms of describing the framework of our struggle with this terrorist movement. Because insurgencies are very oriented toward control of territory, and they have much more legitimacy as a kind of violence than do terrorist groups. And if al-Qaeda is or could be transitioning toward a global insurgency, that leads us to look at them as all being a seamless, connected, global movement that is actually more legitimate and more powerful, I think, than it is. And so I think it's very important for us to try to encourage the failure pathway and discourage this language that we use to talk of the global movement as if it were a seamless insurgency. Well, the killing of a leader, as happened, of course, with bin Laden, can have a huge impact upon operational effectiveness of a group, but al-Qaeda doesn't fit any of the classic structures and sort of profile, if you will, of a group that ends through the decapitation of that group. Groups that end in that pathway generally tend to be young. Al-Qaeda is not a young group. By young, I mean, 5 to 8 years, perhaps. They tend to be very hierarchically structured. Al-Qaeda has hierarchy, but it's also a broad movement with many different little bits and pieces, so it's both networked and hierarchical. It doesn't really fit the structure, and it tends to be focused around an extremely charismatic personality, almost like a cult of personality. And before his death, bin Laden had put in place a very good process of succession. And that's the last thing. It tends to die out between generations, and al-Qaeda had already transitioned between numerous generations, particularly at the mid to upper levels, well before bin Laden died. So it's not the kind of group that will end through decapitation. That doesn't mean that it's not a relief and a good thing, I believe, that bin Laden was killed. When you try to assess the risk of terrorism, it's very complicated, of course, because, as is the case with many different kinds of political and social phenomena, you can't just quantify risk when it comes to terrorism. You can look at numbers of casualties, you can look at numbers of incidents, you can look at some things that appear in numbers, but it's not a perfect system. You can't have a perfect number for risk, but nonetheless, if you understand the way a group is structured, you can get a better sense of a kind of a broad approximation of the risk. And unfortunately, in the United States and in many other countries, there's this tendency to go way beyond where that approximation is, either overstating it or understating it. The dangers of overstating the risk are that your population becomes so anxious and so hypersensitive to the risk that even an attempt to try to carry out an attack can have the same effects that an actual attack would have, because you respond with a kind of hysteria, and the state feels as if it has to prove its ability to have a powerful response, and sometimes that the reaction is not one that is useful for working with the way that a group would end. So an overreaction can lead you to make very stupid mistakes, frankly. But an underreaction is also dangerous. If you don't keep your people aware of the fact that it's possible that they could be subject to a terrorist attack, first of all, if one happens, they're going to have the same kind of panicked reaction. But secondly, they're not well prepared. You don't have the kinds of measures in place that would protect them. You're not spending the resources that you need to spend in order to reduce what risk there is. And you don't have the cooperation of the population in a productive way in helping you identify if there's someone who's about to carry out an attack. So the best thing to do is to move people toward the middle, where you replace fear with knowledge, and they have an understanding of what exactly this group is, what exactly the reality of the risk is, and they can respond productively without pushing the government to make the kinds of mistakes that prevent the group from ending. There's this belief that there are just these two players, that it's the state and the people who live in that state, the potential victims, and then the group. But actually, there's really it's more like a triangle. I mean, you could think of it as a kind of like a Clausewitzian triangle, or, the triangle. The Trinity is very deeply embedded in our culture, in our history. So the triangle is the group, the potential victims, but also at the top of the triangle are all those audiences that the group is trying to reach. So terrorist groups do sometimes strictly want to attack the victims. Sometimes all they want to do is kill a lot of people. I mean, it does happen occasionally, and so there's this two-sided relationship where the group is trying to compel a government to do something. That does happen sometimes. But that's the perspective that we all focus on, and we forget about the third side. And that third side is crucial if the kind of strategy that they're using isn't just compellence, that two-sided thing that we were so familiar with during the height of the nuclear era, but it may be mobilization of a third set of observers, or it may be intimidation, or it may be polarization of the population of that state to make it impossible for that state to continue to govern, to undermine the state and its legitimacy. Or it might be provocation. In other words, to take some sort of action against the state in order to force the state to overreact against the group, and then lose support on the part of the state. You saw that in the 19th century quite a bit, actually. Narodnaya Volya, the group People's Will, the 19th century group that killed the Tsar in Russia in order to try to provoke an overreaction so as to undermine the Tsarist state. That's the classic example. There is surprisingly little science that's used in the study of terrorism. Unlike where there's a tremendous amount of science that's involved with climate change and energy, the study of terrorism has been very politicized and very much oriented toward ideological bias. And so since September 11th, there's been a great deal more progress made in gaining knowledge about just what we've been talking about. And I would say to continue to move toward developing an understanding of actual statistics when it comes to terrorism, where most attacks occur, who are the most likely victims, but also what's the nature of the various groups throughout the world, and most important of all, how do those groups end? What's the best way to encourage them to end? One of the hardest things to accept is that there are situations where it's best not to do anything, or at least not to be at the heart of a dynamic that's unfolding. Terrorism drives governments and states to believe that they have to respond vigorously. And I'm not saying that would have been the right response, that would have been the right reaction for the United States. But what I am saying is that there's a debate that's going on within al-Qaeda, and in a broader sense, as we see very dramatically with the Arab Spring, within the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, and what some people call the Muslim world. And that's not about us. We tend to make it about us because we were hit and we had a tremendous tragedy and we suffered. But we're so focused on ourselves that we can't see that there's a dynamic that we've become involved in, but that we should not determine the outcome of. Al-Qaeda is evolving. We have to watch very closely how Al-Qaeda interacts with what's happening right now in places like Egypt, Tunisia, throughout the whole Arab Spring. It's still too early to say whether the outcome of the dramatic revolutions that are going on is going to continue in the direction that it's going now, where I see Al-Qaeda as being a side player, a peripheral player. A bad outcome, I think it's unlikely, but there is a possibility, would be that Al-Qaeda would be able to take advantage of the upheavals economically, socially, and in many other different dimensions of the changes that are occurring in, particularly in places like Yemen, but even possibly in a place like Egypt. I don't think that's the likely outcome, but there's still at least a danger of that. But the best news, on the other hand, and the news that leads me to say that I do see Al-Qaeda waning at the moment, is that they really have not been in the heart of this revolution that's going on. And they've really been sidelined and have had a very, very difficult time. Zawahiri, the fellow that was number 2 and is now the head of Al-Qaeda, made a very late and very weak and pedantic media presentation about Egypt, and he's Egyptian. And he was very late to the game and clearly irrelevant to what had happened. So that's the good news. I don't really think of myself as either a liberal or a conservative, and I'm very deeply committed to trying to depoliticize the discussion that we have about terrorism. I mean, it sounds counterintuitive because terrorism is a very political threat, but the best way to respond is to try somehow to keep a grip on reality. And that reality, if it's spun, either over or under reacting, can lead to really bad policy. Maybe it's because I've worked on Capitol Hill and I've had to deal with people across the political spectrum. I also work with the military that pride themselves on trying to be, many military at least, apolitical. I personally don't think that, for my work anyway, I don't think that the question is how to rework liberalism or how to rework conservatism. It's how to make a new box and someplace where we can have a convergence of interests and a kind of a renegotiation of the relationship between people and the state in the United States. And I don't see that on either side. I think that's a bigger question. And at the heart, I would say that we need to return to our sense of community and optimism. There was a potential after September 11th for us to develop a new sense of momentum and that new box that we're looking for. And it was replacing our cynicism about authority, trying to realize that many people who are taking action on the part of the whole group are doing so with good motives, moving forward in a way where we see the connections between ourselves, regaining trust, and regaining a sense of responsibility, personal responsibility, something that's not mired in the consumerism and in many ways, hedonistic behavior that we have fallen into, the belief that I deserve this, or I'm a victim of this. Those are dead ends. Instead, we should be moving forward toward, What's the new vision? What can I accomplish? How can I help those who are in positions of authority be better, not just undermine them when they make mistakes? Particularly with respect to terrorism, there's a kind of a gotcha attitude on both sides of this divide that I don't like, liberalism and conservatism. You know, if there's a terrorist attack and it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, you know that the other side, if you listen to the dialogue that goes on in these election seasons, is ready to pounce and say, you weren't strong enough, or you know, you didn't appropriately recognize the threat, and gotcha. But if you see that there is a risk of terrorism, and that risk is never going to be zero, and that the best way for us to deal with that risk as a country is to be realistic about it and to pull together and to develop a kind of a national resilience, then you're in a new box.